Naval Station Norfolk stood imposing against the morning sky, America's largest naval installation bathed in the pale September sunlight of 2020. Red and orange streaked across the horizon, painting the gray warships in the harbor with a momentary warmth that belied the tension pulsing through the base. Intelligence reports had placed the facility at heightened alert for the third consecutive week. Lieutenant Junior Grade James Parker adjusted his cover as he surveyed the security checkpoint. At 32, Parker had the crisp uniform and confidence of a man who had memorized the rulebook but lacked the weathered edges of someone who had written it. His career as a Marine had been marked by ambition rather than combat experience, a fact that gnawed at him like a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. "Sir, Commander Watkins just radioed. Admiral Blackwood's inspection has been moved up by 2 hours," Petty Officer Ramirez reported, standing at attention beside Parker. Parker nodded sharply. "Double the checkpoint personnel. I want IDs scrutinized down to the watermark. No exceptions." "Even for brass, sir?" "Especially for brass." Parker's jaw tightened. "This isn't some shopping mall security detail. This is the nerve center of Atlantic Fleet operations." Parker took his position at the main gate, watching as vehicles lined up for inspection. The morning procession was predictable. Navy personnel in pressed uniforms, civilian contractors with well-worn ID badges, delivery trucks with manifests to be checked against databases. The routine was familiar, a dance of procedure and protocol that Parker had mastered. Until her car pulled up. The sedan was unremarkable, an older model Toyota with government plates. But its driver made Parker's eyes narrow instantly. She was small, no more than 5'4", with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that accentuated sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to catalog everything around her. What caught Parker's attention, however, was her jacket. Olive drab, faded from years of use, with a small golden trident insignia barely visible above the breast pocket. The seal insignia. On a woman. Parker approached the vehicle, Ramirez 2 steps behind him. The woman rolled down her window, her expression neutral, almost bored. She handed over her ID without being asked. "Catherine Reynolds," Parker read aloud, examining the credentials with exaggerated scrutiny. His eyes flicked from the ID to her face, then to the trident on her jacket. "Mind explaining the jacket, ma'am?" The woman, Catherine, regarded him with a calm that felt practiced. "Is there a problem, Lieutenant?" "That would depend on where you got that insignia." Parker's voice hardened. "Impersonating a naval special warfare operator is a federal offense." For 3 heartbeats, Catherine said nothing. Her eyes, Parker noticed, never locked on his face. Instead, they moved constantly, taking in the gate, the positions of the guards, the sight lines to the watchtowers, the traffic patterns behind her. It wasn't the darting gaze of nervousness, but the methodical assessment of someone mapping terrain. "I'm expected at command by 0800, she finally said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone accustomed to statements that weren't questioned. Parker felt his neck flush. "Ma'am, I asked about that jacket. You were wearing a seal trident, and last I checked, there aren't any female seals." Something changed in her posture then, not tension, but a subtle shift into a state of heightened readiness that Parker, despite his training, almost missed. Her hands remained visible on the steering wheel, perfectly still. "Lieutenant, I understand you're doing your job, but I need you to contact Commander Matthews at Naval Special Warfare Command." Her eyes finally met his, and Parker was struck by their flatness, not empty but controlled, like still water hiding depth. "Authorization code Foxtrot 7 Delta Niner." Parker stiffened. Authorization codes weren't thrown around casually, especially ones with the Foxtrot prefix that indicated special operations. "Ramirez, call it in," he ordered, not taking his eyes off Catherine. She didn't fidget or show impatience. She simply waited, her breathing steady, her gaze once again roaming the perimeter with professional interest. While Ramirez made the call, Parker continued his assessment. Catherine Reynolds appeared to be in her mid-30s, fit but not bulky. Her demeanor suggested military training, but the trident was still an anomaly that set his teeth on edge. The SEALs were brothers in arms, a brotherhood, not a place for... His thoughts were interrupted when Catherine shifted slightly in her seat, her sleeve riding up to reveal a distinctive scar on her left wrist. It wasn't the jagged mark of an accident, but the precise, deliberate line of a combat wound. Parker had seen similar scars on operators who had returned from early Afghanistan deployments. "Ma'am, that scar," Parker said, his voice lowering. "Jawbreaker?" A flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly controlled. Operation Jawbreaker had been the code name for one of the first CIA-led operations into Afghanistan after 9/11, with SEAL Team 6 providing critical support. It wasn't common knowledge. "You've done your homework, Lieutenant," Catherine replied, her tone unchanged but carrying a new note of evaluation. She was reassessing him, Parker realized. Ramirez returned, his expression confused. "Sir, command confirms her credentials and says to expedite her entry. They were very insistent." Parker frowned, but procedure was procedure. He handed back the ID. "Sorry for the delay, Ms. Reynolds." "Commander," she corrected quietly. "Commander," Parker repeated, the word tasting strange. "One more question before you proceed. That scar, it's from Jawbreaker, isn't it? 2001? Catherine's eyes met his again, and for the first time, Parker saw something beyond the professional mask, a brief flash of shared understanding between warriors. "The mountains remember what reports forget, Lieutenant," she said softly before rolling up her window and driving through the now open gate. Parker watched the sedan disappear toward the command building, his mind replaying the encounter. The scar, the authorization code, the way she moved and observed, all of it pointed to someone who had seen the darkest corners of war. But a female SEAL commander? Impossible. Unless, from his position in the Security Operations Center, retired Lieutenant Colonel William Bill Harrison watched the gate encounter unfold on the monitor with a mixture of amusement and concern. At 68, Harrison's face bore the weathered creases of a man who had spent decades under foreign suns, his blue eyes still sharp beneath steel-gray eyebrows. The cane leaning against his chair was a concession to age and old injuries, not a surrender to them. "That boy's about to learn a hard lesson about assumptions," Harrison muttered to himself, watching Lieutenant Parker question Catherine Reynolds. Senior Chief Willis, manning the security console beside him, glanced over. "You know her, sir?" Harrison's mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I helped train her back when the agency and Naval Special Warfare were running programs nobody was supposed to know about." On screen, Catherine's sedan was now pulling away from the checkpoint. Harrison tapped a command into the console, bringing up her file, or rather, the heavily redacted version available to someone of his security clearance. The real file, he knew, would require access that few people on the base possessed. "What's she doing here?" Willis asked. "Base inspection isn't until Friday." "Admiral Blackwood moved it up," Harrison replied, his eyes never leaving the monitor. "The question is why Kate's here. She doesn't do inspections." Harrison's mind drifted back to 1994, to a classified training facility in the Appalachian Mountains, where the air was thin and unforgiving. Post-Cold War, pre-9/11, that strange interim period when America thought peace might actually be possible, even as its intelligence apparatus prepared for the next inevitable conflict. He had been 40 then, a veteran of Grenada, Panama, and Desert Storm, seconded to a joint CIA-Navy program so secret that even its codename had a codename. On paper, it was called the Advanced Maritime Operations Integration Program. Those involved simply called it Artemis. The memory was vivid. 12 candidates, only one of them female, standing at attention in the pre-dawn frost as Harrison paced before them. M40A1 sniper rifles slung across their backs, PRC-77 radios, adding 20 pounds to their already heavy rucksacks. "You're here because conventional thinking is a liability in unconventional warfare," he had told them. "You're here because the enemy's expectation is our greatest advantage." The lone woman had been Catherine Reynolds, 24 years old, with academic credentials from Annapolis that outshone her peers in physical scores that, while not record-breaking for men, demonstrated a relentless determination that Harrison had recognized immediately. Where the men relied on brute strength, she utilized leverage, technique, and a calculating mind that stayed cool when others overheated. Artemis wasn't about creating female SEALs, at least not officially. It was about developing specialized operators who could access places and situations that traditional male special forces couldn't. Catherine and those who came after her were ghosts operating in the spaces between official deployments, their existence denied if ever questioned. "Sir?" Willis's voice pulled Harrison back to the present. Senior Command is asking for your presence at the briefing in 30 minutes. Harrison nodded, pushing himself up with his cane. Tell them I'll be there. As he made his way toward the command building, Harrison's thoughts turned to Admiral Thomas Blackwood. At 62, Blackwood was one of the few flag officers who understood the shadows where people like Catherine operated. He and Harrison had served together during Desert Storm, forging a friendship in the crucible of combat that transcended rank and protocol. Later, Blackwood had been one of the architects of Artemis, fighting the bureaucratic battles in Washington while Harrison trained the operators in the field. If Blackwood had called Catherine in and moved up the inspection, something significant was happening, something that required her unique skill set. Harrison entered the command building, nodding to the Marines on duty as he made his way to the secure briefing room. Outside the door stood Commander Matthews, Naval Special Warfare Liaison to Norfolk, his expression grave. Bill, Matthews greeted him with a firm handshake. Been a while. Too long, John. I'm guessing this isn't about the base inspection. Matthews glanced down the hallway, ensuring they were alone. Baranov, he said quietly. The name hit Harrison like a physical blow. Oleg Baranov, former KGB, then FSB, had been one of Russia's most effective operators during the late Cold War period. The intelligence community had presumed him dead after the collapse of the Soviet Union, another casualty of the chaotic transition. Clearly, that presumption had been wrong. He's alive? Harrison asked, his voice dropping to match Matthews' volume. Worse, he's active. Intelligence picked up his electronic signature 2 weeks ago, originating from servers in Estonia. The patterns match his old protocols. Harrison leaned more heavily on his cane. Kate worked the Baranov case in Berlin, 91. Her team was trailing him when the wall was coming down. He vanished during the chaos. That's why she's here, Matthews confirmed. Blackwood wants her assessment. If it is Baranov, we need someone who knows his methods. The door to the briefing room opened, and Admiral Blackwood himself stood in the doorway, tall and imposing despite his age, with close-cropped silver hair and the ramrod posture of a career officer. Blackwood commanded respect without demanding it. Bill, he said warmly, extending his hand. Good to see you. Tom, Harrison replied, the informal address a privilege of their long friendship. Wish it were under better circumstances. Blackwood's expression darkened. You've been briefed? Just the headline, Baranov. Come in, Kate's already here. The briefing room was a windowless space dominated by a large table and multiple screens displaying maps, intelligence reports, and security feeds. Catherine Reynolds stood studying one of the displays, her posture military precise. She turned as they entered, and Harrison saw a brief flash of genuine warmth in her eyes. Colonel, she greeted him, the formality undercut by the slight upward curve of her lips. Commander, he returned with a nod. Still getting into trouble, I see. Learn from the best, sir. Blackwood gestured for everyone to be seated. Let's get started. 23 hours ago, our intelligence assets intercepted communications suggesting an imminent threat to this installation. The signature matches operational protocols developed by the KGB's 9th Directorate during the late 1980s, specifically those attributed to Oleg Baranov. On the main screen appeared a grainy photograph, a man in his 60s with sharp Slavic features, his expression impassive, his eyes calculating. Most of you know the history, Blackwood continued. Baranov was one of the KGB's most effective operatives during the final years of the Cold War. He specialized in penetrating military installations, particularly naval facilities. His team was responsible for the bombing of our Berlin station in '89 that killed 4 operatives. After the Soviet collapse, he disappeared. We assumed he was dead or had retired to some dacha outside Moscow. That assumption was premature, Catherine interjected, her voice clinical. Baranov was too valuable to the remnants of Soviet intelligence. He wouldn't have been discarded. Blackwood nodded. Commander Reynolds has more experience with Baranov's methods than anyone else in this room. Kate, walk us through what you know. Catherine moved to the front of the room with the practiced economy of movement that Harrison recognized from her training days. She hadn't wasted emotion then. She didn't now. Baranov operates with specific patterns, she began, bringing up tactical diagrams on the screen. He uses diversionary attacks to draw security resources to obvious threats, while executing his primary objective with minimal personnel. In Berlin, he detonated a car bomb at the main gate while his actual team infiltrated through a service entrance on the opposite side of the compound. Harrison watched as she methodically detailed Baranov's known operations, her analysis precise and dispassionate. This was the Catherine he had trained, analytical, thorough, and completely focused on the mission parameters. But there was something else in her presentation, a personal edge that hadn't been there before. Baranov wasn't just another target to her. The most concerning aspect, Catherine concluded, is that Baranov never operated without extensive pre-mission intelligence. If he's targeting this facility, he already has inside information, possibly from someone on the base. The room fell silent as the implications settled over them. A mole in Norfolk. Blackwood broke the silence. This is why I've moved up the security inspection. We'll use it as cover to implement enhanced security protocols and begin identifying potential security breaches. And if Baranov moves before we find the leak? Harrison asked. That's why Commander Reynolds is here, Blackwood replied. She knows his playbook better than anyone. We're creating a specialized response team under her command, operating outside the normal chain to maintain operational security. The Admiral turned to Catherine. I need your initial assessment of our vulnerabilities by end of day. Colonel Harrison will provide historical context and assist with identifying potential internal security compromises. As the briefing continued, Harrison studied Catherine's face. She maintained the professional mask she'd perfected over years of covert operations, but he recognized the subtle signs of tension around her eyes. Baranov wasn't just a mission to her. This was personal. He made a mental note to speak with her privately after the briefing. If Baranov was indeed active in targeting Norfolk, they needed to address the history between him and Catherine, a history that went beyond what was in any official file. Outside the gates of Naval Station Norfolk, the day proceeded with the measured rhythm of military precision. Traffic moved through security checkpoints. Ships prepared for deployment. Aircraft conducted routine patrols overhead. The visible machine of American naval power functioned as it had for decades, oblivious to the invisible currents of tension flowing beneath the surface. Admiral Blackwood's motorcade approached the main gate. Two black Suburbans with security personnel flanking the Admiral's sedan. In the lead vehicle, Chief of Security Captain Owens surveyed the approaching checkpoint with professional scrutiny. Gate 3 is our entry point, he spoke into his radio. Standard protocol, maintain formation. Inside the command sedan, Admiral Blackwood reviewed briefing notes on his secure tablet, his mind still processing the implications of Baranov's possible resurgence. Beside him, his aide, Lieutenant Commander Walsh, coordinated the day's inspection schedule. Sir, after the perimeter assessment, you have the meeting with Base Command at 0930, followed by the special briefing with Commander Reynolds' team at 1100, Walsh reported. Blackwood nodded absently, his thoughts elsewhere. Baranov, a name from another era, from the twilight of the Cold War, when adversaries were clearly defined, but their methods increasingly shadowed. He had personally authorized the operation to capture Baranov in Berlin in '91, an operation that had ended with 5 American operatives dead and Baranov vanishing into the chaos of a collapsing Soviet empire. Now, 3 decades later, that ghost had reemerged. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Get me a secure line to Washington, Blackwood instructed. I need to speak with the CNO before the inspection begins. At Gate 3, Lieutenant Parker had resumed his post after the encounter with Catherine Reynolds, his professional demeanor intact, but his certainty shaken. The authorization codes she had provided were legitimate, high-level clearance that even Parker's immediate superiors didn't possess. Sir, Admiral's convoy approaching, Ramirez reported, standing straighter. Parker nodded, pushing thoughts of the mysterious commander aside. Standard procedure, by the book. As the convoy slowed at the checkpoint, Parker approached the lead vehicle, maintaining protocol despite the senior officers inside. Military discipline was rooted in consistency. Exceptions created vulnerabilities. Inside the Security Operations Center, Bill Harrison and Catherine Reynolds watched the gate feeds, evaluating the procedures with the critical eyes of professionals who had spent careers identifying weaknesses in seemingly impenetrable defenses. Your Lieutenant Parker runs a tight operation, Catherine observed, her tone neutral but carrying an undertone of professional assessment. Harrison grunted. By the book, sometimes too much so. Books don't cover every scenario. He recognized my jawbreaker scar, Catherine noted. Most wouldn't make that connection. Parker's ambitious, studies operations reports, intelligence assessments, anything that might give him an edge for promotion. Knows the theory, lacks the practice. Harrison shifted his weight, easing pressure off his bad leg. But he's observant. That counts for something. Catherine's eyes remained on the monitor showing Parker inspecting the Admiral's convoy. Observation without context is just data collection, she replied. He saw my scar but missed my stance, my movement patterns, the way I scanned the perimeter. You'll need him, Harrison said simply. Catherine turned to face her former mentor. For what? Whatever's coming. Harrison met her gaze directly. Burnoff doesn't surface without purpose, Kate. If he's here, if he's active, there's something bigger at play. Catherine's expression remained neutral, but Harrison detected the minute tightening around her eyes that indicated she was processing, calculating. Berlin, she said finally. You were my handler for Berlin. Harrison nodded once. I was. Then you know what happened there, what really happened. I read the after-action report, Harrison replied carefully, and I know when reports omit key details. A moment of silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history. Baranov knew we were coming, Catherine said finally, her voice so low that Harrison had to lean in slightly to hear her. The operation was compromised before we ever crossed into East Berlin. Someone on our side gave us up. That was the assessment, Harrison acknowledged. We never identified the source. If Baranov is targeting Norfolk now, 30 years later, the connection isn't coincidental, Catherine continued, her analytical mind mapping patterns that others might miss. This isn't just about current military assets. This is about finishing something that started during the Cold War. Harrison considered her words. Operation White Birch, he said after a moment. Catherine's eyes widened slightly, the closest thing to surprise she would allow herself to display. That was beyond my clearance level. Mine too, officially, Harrison admitted. But Tom, Admiral Blackwood, brought me in as an unofficial advisor. White Birch was a contingency plan developed by the Soviets in the 1980s. If activated, it would have coordinated simultaneous attacks on key U.S. naval installations, with Norfolk as the primary target. The Cold War ended. Why would Baranov activate it now? Some warriors never acknowledged the war's end, Kate. For them, the battlefield just went quiet for a time. Their conversation was interrupted by an alert tone from the security console. Senior Chief Willis, who had been monitoring the Admiral's entry, straightened suddenly. Sir, we have a situation at Checkpoint Baker, he reported, fingers flying across the keyboard to bring up the relevant feeds. Unidentified truck just blew through the secondary perimeter, not responding to commands to stop. Harrison and Catherine moved instantly to the monitor. The feed showed a heavy-duty cargo truck speeding through the shattered remains of a security barrier, base security vehicles in pursuit. Where's the Admiral's convoy? Catherine demanded, her posture shifting subtly into operational mode. Just clearing Gate 3 now, Willis responded, bringing up that feed as well. Harrison watched as Catherine's eyes narrowed, her gaze darting between the multiple security feeds with practiced assessment. He recognized the look. She was seeing patterns forming, connections that others would miss. It's a diversion, she stated with absolute certainty. The truck is loud, obvious, designed to draw every security asset in that direction. Harrison nodded in agreement, memories of Berlin surfacing. Baranov's playbook. Catherine was already moving toward the door. The real attack will come from the opposite vector. Quietly, probably a small team, 3 to 5 operators at most. Where are you going? Harrison called after her. To do what I was trained for, she replied without turning back. Tell Blackwood to hold position and increase his security detail. This isn't a drill. As Catherine disappeared down the corridor, Harrison turned to Willis. Get me direct comms to the Admiral's security team. Now. Outside, chaos was beginning to unfold. The intruding truck had smashed through another checkpoint, sending personnel scrambling and triggering base-wide alarms. Security vehicles converged on the threat, sirens wailing, leaving other areas of the base with reduced coverage, exactly as Baranov would have planned. At Gate 3, Lieutenant Parker and his team watched the distant commotion with growing tension. The Admiral's convoy had just cleared the checkpoint and was now proceeding toward command. Parker's radio crackled with urgent communications, reports of the breach mixing with commands from multiple authorities. "Sir, they're requesting all available personnel to respond to the Bravo sector breach," Ramirez reported, his young face tense with the sudden crisis. Parker hesitated, training and instinct at war within him. Protocol dictated that he deploy his team to support the response, but something felt wrong, a nagging dissonance that he couldn't immediately identify. Reynolds's words from earlier echoed in his mind. The mountains remember what reports forget. She hadn't been talking about Afghanistan. She had been warning him about institutional memory, about patterns that repeated. His decision crystallized in an instant. Negative. Our position is protecting this access point. Half the team stays here. He pointed to his senior petty officers. Johnson, Garcia, you're with me. We're moving to provide additional security for the Admiral's convoy. "Sir?" Ramirez questioned, confusion evident. "The truck is too obvious," Parker explained tersely, checking his sidearm. "If I wanted to hit a high-value target, I'd create a distraction first." As Parker and his selected team moved quickly toward the route the Admiral's convoy would take, he scanned the surroundings with newfound awareness. The base had transformed from a secure facility into a tactical environment, every shadow potentially concealing a threat, every blind spot a vulnerability. He spotted them almost by accident, three figures in dark clothing moving with purposeful stealth between buildings, on an intercept course with the Admiral's route. They moved with the practiced coordination of a trained unit, their movements economical and precise. Parker keyed his radio. "Security Command, this is Lieutenant Parker. I have eyes on 3 unauthorized personnel approaching Quarter 7, possible hostile intent toward the Admiral's convoy, requesting immediate backup." The radio crackled with static. Then Harrison's voice came through. "Parker, this is Harrison. Be advised, Commander Reynolds is en route to your position. Do not engage without backup. Repeat, do not engage." But Parker could see the threat developing too quickly. The infiltrators had taken positions along the Admiral's route, one of them producing what appeared to be a compact weapon from beneath his jacket. The convoy was less than 30 seconds from entering their kill zone. "No time," Parker responded, then turned to his team. "Johnson, left flank, Garcia with me, non-lethal if possible, but protect the convoy at all costs." As Parker and his men moved to intercept, a blur of motion caught his peripheral vision. A small figure moving with extraordinary speed and purpose, Catherine Reynolds, covering ground with the focused intensity of a predator. What happened next would forever alter Parker's understanding of combat capability. Reynolds reached the first infiltrator before he registered her presence. There was no wasted movement, no telegraphed intent, just the fluid application of precisely calculated force. She didn't strike the man so much as redirect his existing momentum, using his own mass and motion against him with devastating efficiency. His wrist, caught in mid-draw of his weapon, bent at an impossible angle against a concrete barrier edge. The sickening crack was audible even at Parker's distance. The second attacker turned toward the commotion, but Reynolds was already moving again. She used the door of a parked vehicle as both shield and weapon, slamming it into the man's knees with calculated force. As he buckled, her hand found his throat in a precise strike that left him crumpling to the ground, disabled but alive. The third infiltrator, witnessing the fate of his companions, made the fatal error of hesitation. That fractional pause was all Reynolds needed. She closed the distance in 3 explosive steps, delivering a series of strikes so fast that Parker could barely track the individual movements. This wasn't the choreographed combat of training exercises. This was the brutal efficiency of someone who had learned that in real combat, every extended second increased the risk of death. 5 seconds. That was all it had taken. 3 highly trained operatives neutralized by a single individual with such clinical precision that it appeared almost routine. As the Admiral's convoy approached, now alerted to the threat, Reynolds stood calmly amidst the incapacitated infiltrators, her breathing controlled, her posture reset to its neutral baseline. Parker and his team arrived moments later, weapons drawn but with no targets remaining. Secure them, Reynolds ordered, her voice level as if she were commenting on the weather. Check for chemical or biological agents. Baranov has used them before. Parker stared at her, then at the three men on the ground, his perception of reality undergoing a seismic shift. The seal trident on her jacket wasn't stolen valor. It was earned in shadows he hadn't known existed. The Admiral's security detail poured out of the vehicles, establishing a protective cordon around Blackwood's sedan. But the Admiral himself emerged, waving them back, his eyes fixed on Reynolds in the neutralized threat. Commander, Blackwood acknowledged, his voice carrying the weight of command, but also profound respect. Situation? Contained, sir, Reynolds replied, but this was just the opening move. Baranov is testing our responses, mapping our security protocols. The real attack is still coming. As base security personnel arrived to take custody of the attackers, Parker noticed Reynolds kneeling beside the third man, who was beginning to regain consciousness. She spoke to him in what Parker recognized as fluent Russian, her tone conversational, but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. The man's response was weak, but clear enough for Parker to hear. Salamander Ziv. Salamander lives. Reynolds' expression didn't change, but Parker caught the momentary stillness that suggested the words carried significant meaning. She rose and turned to Admiral Blackwood. Sir, we need to talk, privately. Blackwood nodded grimly. My office, now. He turned to Parker. Lieutenant, you as well. You made the right call, staying at your post. That kind of judgment can't be taught. As they moved toward the command building, Parker found himself walking beside Reynolds. The woman who had just demonstrated combat skills beyond anything he had witnessed in his career now moved with the same calm efficiency she had shown at the gate, no hint of adrenaline or post-combat stress visible in her demeanor. Commander, he said quietly, I owe you an apology for earlier. Reynolds glanced at him, her expression unreadable. No, Lieutenant, you don't. You were doing your job. A pause, then, and you made the right call just now, recognizing the diversion for what it was. Most wouldn't have. It wasn't forgiveness or praise, Parker realized. It was a professional acknowledgement from one operator to another. Somehow that meant more. As they entered the secure command building, alarms still blaring across the base, Parker understood that he had just become involved in something far beyond routine security operations. The calm, petite woman walking ahead of him wasn't just a commander with unusual credentials. She was something the Navy didn't officially acknowledge existed. And whatever was happening at Norfolk, whatever ghost from the Cold War had resurfaced, Catherine Reynolds had been brought in because conventional forces weren't equipped to handle it. The real war, Parker realized, was just beginning. The aftermath of chaos carried its own particular silence. As emergency vehicles converged on the breach checkpoint, their sirens creating a cacophony in the distance, a different kind of quiet settled over Admiral Blackwood's office. It was the heavy stillness of revelation, of pieces falling into deadly alignment. Lieutenant Parker stood at parade rest near the door, still processing what he had witnessed. The three attackers, professional operators by every measure of their movement and equipment, had been neutralized with a surgical precision that defied his understanding of combat dynamics. And the woman who had executed this impossible feat now sat across from Admiral Blackwood, her posture relaxed but alert, as if the engagement had been nothing more than a brisk morning exercise. Bill Harrison completed the triangle, leaning on his cane beside the Admiral's desk, his weathered face grim as satellite imagery of the base appeared on the wall screen. The truck was unmanned, Blackwood stated, reviewing the preliminary security report. Remote-controlled, sent on a pre-programmed route, sophisticated electronics, military grade. Catherine Reynolds nodded, unsurprised. Baranov doesn't waste personnel on suicide missions. The truck was never meant to reach a target, just create maximum disruption. While his actual team made their move on you, Harrison added, looking at Blackwood. Three operatives, Catherine continued, her tone clinical and detached. Former Spetsnaz by their movement patterns and hand-to-hand techniques. They were carrying Bulgarian-made PSM pistols with suppressors. Cold War-era weapons, difficult to trace. Parker marveled at her assessment. In the chaos of combat, she had cataloged these details with the methodical precision of someone taking inventory. The third operative said something to you, Blackwood prompted. Salamander lives. What does that mean? A subtle tension appeared at the corners of Catherine's eyes, the first crack in her professional facade that Parker had observed. Salamander was a code name, she replied after a measured pause. Used for a deep-cover Soviet asset we believe was planted in U.S. naval intelligence during the late 1980s. When the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed, the operation to identify Salamander was abandoned, low priority in the New World Order. Harrison's grip tightened on his cane. If Baranov is activating a dormant asset after all these years, then this isn't just about attacking a naval base, Blackwood finished, the implications settling heavily in the room. This is about reviving an operation that never officially ended. Catherine rose and moved to the wall screen, bringing up the security footage of the three attackers approaching the Admiral's convoy. Her movements were fluid and economical, nothing wasted. These men weren't just sent to assassinate you, Admiral, she said, freezing the frame and zooming in on equipment barely visible beneath their jackets. They're carrying specialized surveillance equipment designed to map security responses, catalog communications protocols. Intelligence gathering, Harrison murmured. This was phase one of a multi-stage operation, Catherine confirmed. Baranov is mapping our reactions, timing our responses, identifying weak points in our security architecture. Parker found his voice. Commander, when you engage them, that wasn't standard naval special warfare training. All eyes turned to him, and Parker felt a moment of uncertainty, wondering if he had overstepped. But Catherine regarded him with a calculating gaze that held neither offense nor surprise. You're right, Lieutenant. It wasn't. She turned back to the screen. The program I was part of incorporated multiple combat systems, including several developed by Soviet Special Forces. Know your enemy by becoming your enemy. Admiral Blackwood rose from his desk, the decision already formed in his eyes. Commander Reynolds will lead a specialized team to identify and neutralize this threat. Lieutenant Parker, you're assigned as her liaison to base security. Parker blinked in surprise. Sir? You made the right call at the gate, Blackwood said simply. When everyone else was focused on the obvious threat, you recognized the real danger. That's the kind of thinking we need right now. Harrison nodded in agreement. Sometimes seeing what isn't there is more valuable than seeing what is. Catherine's expression remained neutral, but Parker detected the subtle evaluation in her gaze. She was reassessing him, recalculating his potential value. Sir, Parker began cautiously, Commander Reynolds' combat capabilities are exceptional, but I'm not familiar with the program she mentioned. No one is, Lieutenant, Blackwood replied. That's rather the point. Catherine turned to face Parker fully. The Artemis program was established in 1992, Joint CIA and Naval Special Warfare Operation to develop specialized infiltration and counterintelligence capabilities that enemies wouldn't anticipate. Female operators who could access places and situations that traditional male special forces couldn't. But women aren't allowed in combat roles, especially not special operations, Parker said, then immediately regretted the words. Not because they were incorrect, officially they weren't, but because they revealed his inability to reconcile official policy with the reality standing before him. On paper, Lieutenant, Catherine replied without heat. On paper, I've spent my career as an intelligence analyst with occasional field consultant duties. On paper, I've never led a kill team into Kandahar or extracted high-value targets from Fallujah. The silence that followed was profound. Parker's understanding of military structure, of the rigid hierarchies and demarcations he had built his career upon, underwent a seismic restructuring. Admiral Blackwood broke the silence. We can continue this history lesson later. Right now, we need to secure this base and identify Salamander before Baranov activates the next phase of his operation. The wall screen changed to display a base-wide security alert. Throughout Norfolk, security teams were mobilizing, checkpoints were being reinforced, and the base was transitioning to Delta-level security protocols. We have a complication, Harrison interjected, reviewing a message on his secure tablet. The captured operatives are dead. What? Blackwood demanded. How? Cyanide capsules embedded in their molars. Cold War technology. They activated them during transport to the detention facility. Catherine showed no surprise. Standard protocol for Baranov's teams. No one gets taken alive. Harrison continued grimly. Before they died, one of them said something else. The interrogation team recorded it. The white birch still grows. The color drained from Blackwood's face. Operation White Birch. That's impossible. Those plans were abandoned decades ago. What's Operation White Birch? Parker asked, sensing a critical piece of information he was missing. Catherine and Harrison exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Blackwood nodded once, authorizing disclosure. Operation White Birch was a Soviet contingency plan developed in the 1980s, Harrison explained. If activated, it would coordinate simultaneous attacks on key U.S. naval installations, with Norfolk as the primary target. The goal wasn't just tactical damage, it was to cripple America's naval command structure in the Atlantic. The operation required deep cover assets placed years in advance, Catherine added. Salamander was one of those assets, believed to be placed somewhere in the naval command chain. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we assumed those operations were abandoned. Clearly that assumption was premature, Blackwood said, his voice hardening with resolve. Commander Reynolds, assemble your team. Full operational authority, classification level Theta 9. Lieutenant Parker, you'll provide base resources and personnel as needed. As the meeting concluded, Parker found himself walking alongside Catherine down the secure corridor. The base around them had transformed into a hive of controlled urgency, security personnel moving with purposeful haste, their expressions tense with the knowledge that an unknown threat had penetrated their defenses. Commander, Parker began, still struggling to align the woman beside him with what he had witnessed. Those combat techniques you used, I've never seen anything like that. Catherine glanced at him, her pace never slowing. The Artemis program incorporated multiple combat systems, Systema from Russian Special Forces, Krav Maga from Israeli Security Services, elements of Filipino Kali for weapons manipulation. She spoke matter-of-factly, as if discussing routine training protocols. But the most effective system was one developed specifically for the program, called Adaptive Kinetic Response. It focuses on leveraging an opponent's mass, momentum, and psychological expectations against them. And the program was specifically for women? For operators who would be consistently underestimated by adversaries, she corrected. Size, gender, appearance, these create expectations. Expectations create blind spots. Blind spots create opportunities. As they reached the Security Operations Center, alarms still blaring throughout the base, Parker realized he was being given a rare glimpse into a shadow world of American military operations, a world where the rules he had memorized were merely the visible surface of a much deeper, more complex reality. Lieutenant, Catherine said, pausing at the threshold, what you saw today doesn't exist in any manual. It's not taught at any academy. It exists because wars aren't always fought in the open by uniformed combatants. Sometimes they're fought in the shadows by people no one sees coming. With that, she entered the operations center, leaving Parker with the unsettling awareness that the real battle was just beginning. The secure briefing room had been transformed into an operational command center. Screens displayed real-time security feeds from across the base, satellite imagery, personnel files, and historical intelligence reports. The normal chain of command had been temporarily suspended, replaced by a specialized task force operating under Admiral Blackwood's direct authority. Catherine Reynolds stood at the center of this controlled storm, directing resources with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to commanding in crisis. Bill Harrison occupied a corner position, his experience and institutional knowledge a counterweight to the urgency of younger officers. Lieutenant Parker entered the room, carrying a secure tablet with the latest security assessments. The atmosphere struck him immediately, focused intensity without panic, methodical preparation without wasted motion. This was how elite units operated. No grandstanding, no unnecessary communication, just the streamlined efficiency of professionals who understood that lives depended on their performance. Lieutenant, Catherine acknowledged him without looking up from the tactical display. What's the status of the perimeter reinforcement? Completed all major access points, Parker reported. We've implemented rolling patrol patterns as you suggested, varying times and routes to prevent predictability. She nodded once, approval conveyed in the briefest of gestures. And the communications security protocols? Encrypted channels are established. All non-essential communications have been moved to separate frequencies. Catherine finally looked up, her eyes meeting his with that same evaluating gaze. Good. You understand the importance of communications discipline. It wasn't a question, but Parker found himself responding anyway. Yes, ma'am. In Desert Storm, Iraqi forces targeted predictable radio traffic patterns to locate command posts. A flicker of something, perhaps approval, crossed her face. You've studied your history, Lieutenant. Before Parker could respond, the room's atmosphere shifted as Admiral Blackwood entered, accompanied by Commander Matthews from Naval Special Warfare Command. The Admiral's expression was grim, his normally impeccable uniform showing signs of a long, tense day. We have confirmation, Blackwood announced without preamble. The fingerprints from our deceased visitors match former Spetsnaz operators, all believed to have been working as private contractors since the Soviet collapse. Harrison straightened in his chair. Baranov's recruiting from the old networks. More concerning, Blackwood continued, is what we found on their equipment. He nodded to Matthews, who activated the main display. The screen filled with the technical schematics that Parker recognized immediately. Norfolk's power distribution systems, water treatment facilities, and communications infrastructure. They had detailed knowledge of critical systems, Matthews explained, knowledge that isn't publicly available. Salamander, Catherine stated, the word hanging in the air like a verdict. Blackwood nodded grimly. We have to assume that Baranov has access to internal information, which means we have a breach, possibly at a senior level. The implications settled heavily over the room. Someone within the command structure, someone with high-level access, was compromised. We need to establish a secure information perimeter, Catherine said, her mind already mapping containment strategies. Limit knowledge of our operations to this room only. Create a controlled information environment where we can identify abnormal data access or unusual communication patterns. Agreed, Blackwood said. But first, I think it's time Lieutenant Parker understood exactly who he's working with. He turned to Matthews. Commander, please access file Artemis 7 Alpha. Full disclosure, my authorization. Matthews hesitated. Sir, that file requires Theta 9 clearance. Lieutenant Parker has been granted provisional Theta 9 for the duration of this operation, Blackwood stated firmly. We can't afford compartmentalization right now. As Matthews input the authorization codes into the secure system, Parker felt a weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. Theta 9 clearance was reserved for the most sensitive operations, information so classified that its very existence was denied at the highest levels of government. The main screen changed, displaying a personnel file with Catherine Reynolds' military identification photo. Unlike standard military files, this one bore no official branch insignia, only a simple designation. Artemis Program, Operative Alpha 6. Matthews began the briefing. Commander Catherine Reynolds, what you already know from her official record, Naval Academy graduate, class of 1990, intelligence officer with specializations in Russian operations and counterterrorism, is only the surface layer. The screen changed to show mission locations spanning the globe. Panama, Iraq, Bosnia, Afghanistan. Locations that aligned with every major U.S. military operation of the past 3 decades. Commander Reynolds has participated in operations that officially never occurred, Matthews stated plainly. Operation Just Cause in Panama, where she infiltrated the headquarters of Manuel Noriega to retrieve classified documents before U.S. forces arrived. Desert Storm, where she operated behind enemy lines, identifying Iraqi command bunkers for targeting. Bosnia, Afghanistan, Iraq. The list continues. The next image caused Parker to inhale sharply. Catherine in desert camouflage, standing amid a team of bearded special forces operators in the mountains of Afghanistan, an environment Parker recognized immediately from his own deployments. In 2002, during Operation Enduring Freedom, Commander Reynolds was attached to a joint special operations team tracking high-value targets near the Pakistan border. When the team was ambushed and cut off from support, Reynolds navigated them through 70 kilometers of hostile territory, engaging in multiple combat actions, and successfully extracted the entire unit without casualties. Matthews paused, his expression solemn. For actions during that operation, Commander Reynolds was awarded the Navy Cross. The citation was classified. Parker's mind struggled to reconcile the woman sitting calmly across the room with the operative described in the briefing. The scope of her experience, the depth of her operational history, dwarfed his own military career. In addition, Matthews continued, Commander Reynolds has received the Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor Device, and Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters. All citations remain classified. Admiral Blackwood stepped forward. There's one more thing, Lieutenant. Something not in even this file. He glanced at Catherine, receiving a subtle nod of permission. In 2004, during a classified operation in Fallujah, Commander Reynolds' actions saved an entire Marine platoon caught in a complex ambush. Those actions resulted in the award of the Medal of Honor, presented in a private ceremony by the President himself. The room fell silent. The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor, a recognition of sacrifice and courage beyond the call of duty. Parker had never met a recipient before. The medal remains in a vault at the Pentagon, Blackwood added quietly. Like much of Commander Reynolds' service, it's not for public knowledge. Harrison, who had remained silent throughout the briefing, finally spoke. Tell him about Berlin, Kate. He needs to understand that connection. Catherine's expression remained neutral, but Parker detected a subtle shift in her posture, a tightening, a preparation. In 1991, she began, her voice measured and controlled. I was part of Artemis Team Alpha, 6 female operators deployed to Eastern Europe during the final days of the Soviet Union. Our mission was to track and identify Soviet intelligence officers who might go rogue during the collapse, taking state secrets or weapons technology to sell to the highest bidder. Buranov was one of those targets, Harrison added. Catherine nodded. Oleg Buranov, former KGB director at S, specializing in sabotage operations against NATO installations. He was believed to be coordinating a network of deep cover assets throughout Europe and the United States. Assets like Salamander. The screen changed to show a map of divided Berlin, highlighting a section of the former East Berlin. The operation was compromised before it began, Catherine stated flatly. Buranov was waiting. He detonated explosives at our planned extraction point, killing 3 members of Team Alpha and 2 CIA support personnel. He escaped in the chaos that followed. Parker processed this information, connecting it to the current threat. And now he's resurfaced, activating a network that's been dormant for decades. Including Salamander, Catherine confirmed, a deep cover asset believed to be placed within U.S. Naval Command. We never identified who it was before the operation was shut down. Admiral Blackwood's expression darkened. After the Soviet collapse, counterintelligence priorities shifted. Resources were redirected toward emerging threats. The hunt for dormant Soviet assets was deprioritized. And now we're paying the price for that decision, Harrison said grimly. The implications settled over the room like a physical weight. If Buranov had indeed activated a dormant asset within Naval Command, someone with decades of established cover and access, the threat to Norfolk wasn't just external. It was already inside the walls. Lieutenant, Blackwood said, turning to Parker, now you understand why Commander Reynolds is leading this operation. Her experience with Buranov, her specialized training, and her unique capabilities make her our best chance at stopping whatever he's planning. Parker nodded, his perception of Catherine Reynolds fundamentally altered. The woman he had questioned at the gate hours earlier wasn't just an anomaly in the system. She was the embodiment of a shadow war that had never truly ended. A war fought not with aircraft carriers and missile cruisers, but with whispers, deception, and precise violence in dark corners. Sir, Parker said, addressing Blackwood but looking at Catherine, I understand, and I'm ready to provide whatever support Commander Reynolds requires. For the first time, Catherine offered what might have been the ghost of a smile, not warmth but professional acknowledgement. Good, because we're going hunting, Lieutenant, and our prey has had 30 years to prepare for this moment. The interrogation room in Norfolk's security complex was designed to intimidate with its stark functionality. Bare walls, reinforced steel table bolted to the floor, camera monitoring from multiple angles. But the man seated at the table showed no signs of discomfort or concern. His posture was relaxed, almost indifferent, his weathered face bearing the impassive expression of someone accustomed to interrogation techniques. Lieutenant Parker observed through the one-way glass as Catherine Reynolds entered the room. She had changed from her naval uniform into nondescript civilian clothing, her hair now loose around her shoulders, her entire demeanor subtly altered. Even her walk had changed, taking on a slight hesitation that hadn't been present before. Remarkable, Harrison murmured beside Parker. She's adapted her entire presentation. Sir? Parker questioned. Watch, Harrison instructed. This isn't an interrogation, it's a performance. Inside the room, Catherine sat across from the prisoner, her body language suggesting uncertainty rather than authority. When she spoke, her voice carried a slight tremor that Parker knew was entirely manufactured. Mr. Petrov, she began in fluent Russian, I'm just a translator brought in to clarify some points. The senior officers will be here shortly. The prisoner, Alexei Petrov, according to his identification, assessed her with the cold calculation of a predator gauging potential prey. His response came in heavily accented English. I will speak only to ranking officers, not to secretaries. Catherine ducked her head slightly, the picture of intimidated compliance. Of course, but while we wait, perhaps I could get you something? Water? Coffee? Petrov's eyes narrowed, detecting something beneath the subservient demeanor that raised his suspicions. Nothing. Tell your superiors I have diplomatic immunity under the conventions of 1961. A bold claim for a man carrying falsified Ukrainian credentials and illegal weapons on a U.S. military installation, Catherine replied, her voice suddenly stripped of the artificial tremor, her posture straightening into the commanded presence Parker had observed earlier. The transformation was so abrupt that even Petrov, clearly a trained operative, couldn't hide his momentary surprise. You're not a translator, he stated, reassessing her with new wariness. No, Mr. Petrov. Or should I say, Captain Leonov of the former 45th Spetsnaz Regiment. Catherine's eyes locked onto his, all pretense abandoned. Your palm calluses match the distinctive pattern of someone trained in the Soviet hand-to-hand combat system practiced at the Ryazin Higher Airborne Command School. Your left earlobe shows the characteristic scarring from prolonged use of the old model Elekta field communication systems. And you have a very distinctive knife scar on your right forearm that matches wounds inflicted by a Pakistani tribal fighter during a Soviet operation in 1987. Petrov's expression remained controlled, but Parker could see the minute widening of his eyes that betrayed his shock at being so thoroughly identified. You were part of Baranov's personal security detail during his time with Directorate S, Catherine continued relentlessly. You followed him into private contracting after the collapse. You've been his right hand for over 30 years. Silence stretched between them, a tactical pause that Catherine allowed to extend until Petrov finally broke it. If you know so much, he said, his voice now devoid of the previous accent, then you know that men like me do not break under questioning. I'm not here to break you, Captain, Catherine replied calmly. You've already told us what we need to know. Confusion flickered across Petrov's face. I have said nothing. Your attack on the Admiral's convoy wasn't meant to succeed, Catherine stated. It was a probe testing our security responses. But the method, the specific approach vectors, the timing, the equipment your team carried, they all match protocols developed for Operation White Birch. The name landed like a physical blow. Petrov's composure cracked for a fraction of a second, enough to confirm Catherine's assertion. White Birch was abandoned decades ago, he said carefully. And yet here you are implementing its first phase, Catherine countered. Testing security, mapping response patterns, preparing for the main assault, just as the original operation specified. Petrov's expression hardened. You cannot stop what has already begun. Perhaps, but Baranov made a critical error. Catherine leaned forward slightly. He sent you. I do not understand. Berlin, 91. Catherine's voice remained steady, but Parker detected a new intensity beneath the words. You were there, weren't you? At the Normannenstrasse complex when Baranov detonated the explosives. You saw what happened to my team. Recognition dawned in Petrov's eyes. You were one of the women, Artemis. Yes. We thought you all died in the explosion. Not all of us. The atmosphere in the room changed, charged with a history of violence and loss that transcended the current confrontation. Salamander? Catherine said suddenly. Who is Salamander? Petrov's expression closed again, training reasserting itself. I do not know this name. Baranov is activating a deep cover asset inside Naval Command. You know who it is? I know nothing. Catherine's approach shifted again, her voice lowering to a near whisper. When your teammates were taken into custody, they activated their suicide protocols. Old-school cyanide capsules in the molars. Very KGB. Before he died, one of them said, "Salamander lives," another mention in white birch. "You're the only one left, Captain. The only one who can explain why Baranov is reviving a Cold War operation 30 years after it was supposedly abandoned." Petrov remained silent, his training evident in his disciplined resistance. But Catherine had planted the seeds, Parker realized. She had demonstrated knowledge that unsettled the prisoner, created uncertainties where before there had been only confidence. "You won't talk now," Catherine acknowledged, rising from her seat. "That's expected. But consider this. If Baranov is reviving White Birch, he's operating without state sanction. This isn't an official Russian operation, which means when it fails, and it will fail, there will be no diplomatic protection, no prisoner exchanges, no acknowledgement from Moscow." She paused at the door. "You'll simply be erased, like you never existed." As Catherine exited the interrogation room, Parker and Harrison met her in the corridor. "You think he'll talk?" Parker asked. "Not immediately," Catherine replied, "but I've given him something to consider. Operatives like Petrov were trained to resist interrogation by hostile state actors. But Baranov isn't working for a state anymore. He's pursuing a personal vendetta, a mission that died with the Soviet Union. That changes the calculus of loyalty." They moved toward the command center, Harrison keeping pace despite his cane. "The reference to White Birch confirms our suspicions," Harrison said grimly. "Baranov is implementing the original Soviet plan." "Which means what, exactly?" Parker asked. Catherine's expression remained professionally neutral, but her eyes had taken on the focused intensity that Parker was learning to recognize as her operational mode. Operation White Birch was designed to cripple America's Atlantic Fleet command structure in a single coordinated strike, she explained. The original plan called for simultaneous attacks on power systems, communications networks, and key personnel. But the centerpiece was targeting the nuclear command bunkers beneath the base. Parker felt a chill at the implications. The hardened command center? That's 18 levels down, protected by multiple security systems. "Which is why Baranov needs Salamander," Harrison interjected. "Someone with high-level access, someone who's been in place long enough to have detailed knowledge of those systems. Someone no one would suspect," Catherine added quietly. As they reached the command center, Admiral Blackwood was concluding a secure call, his expression grave. The room had been further secured, with additional authentication protocols implemented and non-essential personnel removed. "We have a problem," Blackwood announced as they entered. "Two more security breaches have been detected at opposite ends of the base. Diversionary tactics, but they're stretching our response teams thin." "He's mapping our resource allocation patterns," Catherine assessed immediately. "Calculating response times, identifying which areas receive priority coverage." "There's more," Blackwood continued. "Naval intelligence just intercepted fragments of encrypted communications using old Soviet protocols. The transmissions originated from somewhere inside the base. The implication was clear. Salamander was active, communicating with Baranov's team. "We need to lock down all communications," Catherine stated firmly. "Create a closed system where we can monitor every transmission." "Already in progress," Blackwood confirmed. "But there's one more development. The facial recognition system flagged this image from a security camera near the east perimeter. The main screen displayed a grainy but unmistakable image. An older man with sharp Slavic features and cold, calculating eyes, captured briefly by a camera before disappearing from view. "Baranov," Catherine said, her voice betraying no emotion despite the significance. "He's here, on the base." Parker studied the image with growing concern. "How did he get past the perimeter?" "The same way his team did," Harrison replied grimly. "With inside help." Catherine turned to Admiral Blackwood. "Sir, we need to accelerate our timeline. If Baranov is personally on site, the main operation is imminent." Blackwood nodded sharply. "Agreed, very. Lieutenant Parker, Coordinate with base security to implement Protocol Delta 7. All personnel are to be verified with secondary authentication measures. No one enters secure areas without direct visual confirmation. As Parker moved to comply, Catherine called after him. "Lieutenant, a moment." He paused, turning back to her. "Trust no one," she said quietly, her eyes conveying the deadly seriousness of her warning. "Not even those you've served with for years. Salamander has been in place for decades, establishing cover, building relationships, creating a persona above suspicion." Parker absorbed this warning, understanding its weight. How do we identify them? "By creating a controlled information environment," she replied. "Feed different information to different channels. See which details reach Baranov. It's how we'll trace the leak back to its source." As Parker departed to implement the security protocols, Catherine turned back to Admiral Blackwood and Harrison, her expression resolute. "Gentlemen," she said, "we need to prepare for what comes next. Baranov isn't here just to gather intelligence. He's here to execute the final phase of White Birch. And if the original plan is any indication, that means targeting the nuclear command bunkers." "The bunkers are secure," Blackwood stated firmly. "Multiple authentication systems, biometric verification, hardened communication lines. All designed to prevent external penetration," Catherine countered. "But what about internal sabotage? Someone with legitimate access, someone who's been positioning themselves for years." Harrison's expression darkened with realization. "Someone high in the chain of command, someone who would have access to the bunker during a crisis." "Exactly," Catherine confirmed, "and Baranov has just manufactured that crisis." The implications settled over them like a shadow from the past. A Cold War plot frozen in time, now thawing in the new century, its architects patient enough to wait decades for the perfect moment to strike. "We need to identify Salamander," Catherine stated firmly, "before Baranov executes the final phase." "And how do we do that?" Blackwood asked. Catherine's eyes took on a cold determination that Parker was coming to recognize as her combat focus, the look of a predator assessing its environment before the strike. "By becoming the hunters instead of the hunted," she replied. "Baranov thinks he's controlling the scenario, mapping our responses to his provocations. We're going to change the game." In the security control room, Lieutenant Parker implemented the enhanced verification protocols, watching as the base transformed into a fortress within a fortress. As sirens continued to sound in the distance, marking yet another security probe by Baranov's team, Parker found himself contemplating Catherine Reynolds' warning. Trust no one. The enemy wasn't just at the gates. The enemy was already inside, wearing a trusted face, carrying legitimate credentials, moving freely through the heart of American naval power. Someone who had waited patiently for decades, building a life and career while harboring the deadly secret of their true allegiance. Somewhere on the base, Oleg Baranov, a ghost from the Cold War, was preparing to complete a mission conceived in a conflict that had officially ended 30 years ago. And beside him, invisible until the crucial moment, stood Salamander, the traitor whose identity remained hidden behind a mask of loyalty and service. The real battle, Parker realized, wasn't against external forces, but against the shadows that had lived among them all along, waiting for the moment to strike from within. Night descended on Naval Station Norfolk like a tactical cloak, the darkness broken only by security floodlights that created islands of harsh illumination amid seas of shadow. The base hummed with controlled tension, personnel movements restricted, security teams positioned at strategic locations, communications limited to essential channels only. To the untrained eye, it might have appeared as a standard elevated security posture. To those who knew what to look for, it was a fortress preparing for siege from within. In the makeshift command center, Lieutenant Parker studied the array of personnel files displayed on the tactical screen. 36 senior officers with access to the nuclear command bunkers. 36 careers of distinguished service. 36 potential identities for Salamander. "You won't find them by looking at service records," Catherine Reynolds said quietly, appearing at his side with a silent movement that still unnerved him. "Deep cover agents don't have suspicious gaps or inconsistencies. Their backgrounds are meticulously crafted, often using elements of real people's histories." Parker nodded, not surprised that she had read his intention. Then how do we identify them? By understanding the psychology of the deep cover operative, Bill Harrison interjected, joining them at the display. He leaned on his cane, his weathered face grave in the blue light of the screen. Salamander has lived a double life for decades. That creates patterns of behavior, psychological tells that emerge under pressure. Harrison moved closer to the screen, studying the faces with the careful assessment of a man who had spent a lifetime evaluating human assets and threats. Look for someone who's never quite fit in, yet never stood out enough to raise suspicion, he continued. Someone who maintains emotional distance while appearing collegial. Someone whose personal life remains vague despite years of service alongside the same colleagues. That describes half the senior officer course, Parker observed with a frown. Which is why traditional counterintelligence methods won't work, Catherine agreed. We need to force Salamander to reveal themselves through action rather than background. She turned to the operational map of the base, where security positions were marked in real time, shifting as teams responded to various alerts and provocations that had continued throughout the evening. Baranov is creating chaos to map our security responses, she explained. He's identifying gaps, weak points, establishing patterns he can exploit for the main operation. But he needs inside information, updates on our countermeasures, changes in protocols, unexpected deployments. Parker began to see the strategy forming. So Salamander has to communicate with him, passing information through whatever secure channel they have established. Exactly, Catherine confirmed. We create a controlled information environment. Feed different pieces of information to different potential suspects. See which details reach Baranov. A canary trap, Harrison said with grim approval. Admiral Blackwood entered the command center, his uniform still crisp despite the hours of crisis management. The Admiral's presence immediately shifted the energy of the room, personnel straightening at their stations, conversations dropping to focused murmurs. Commander, your assessment? Blackwood asked without preamble. Catherine moved to the central display, bringing up a schematic of the base with key areas highlighted. Baranov's probing attacks have established a pattern. He's testing response times to the perimeter, communication centers, and power distribution nodes, all consistent with the original White Birch protocols. But there's a specific focus on approaches to the central command bunker. His primary target, Blackwood concluded. Yes, sir. The original plan called for a coordinated strike, disable power and communications, create multiple diversionary threats, then penetrate the command bunker with a specialized team. To what end? Parker asked. Even if they gained access, they couldn't hold it against a full base response. Catherine's expression remained professionally neutral, but her eyes carried a shadow of knowledge that made Parker's question die in his throat. They don't need to hold it, Harrison answered quietly. White Birch wasn't designed as an occupation strategy. It was a decapitation strike, followed by a scorched earth protocol. The implications settled heavily in the room. Not capture, destruction. We've implemented the canary trap, Catherine continued, bringing the briefing back to operational matters. Different information packets distributed to each of our primary suspects. If Baranov responds to specific bait, we'll know which channel it came through. Time frame? Blackwood asked. Based on the escalating pattern of his probes, I'd estimate the main operation will commence within the next 12 hours, Catherine replied. Likely during the shift change at 0600. Parker studied the tactical display, a thought forming. Commander, all of Baranov's probes have been external penetrations, but if Salamander has been in place for decades, they could simply open the door from inside, Catherine finished, a glint of approval in her eyes at his insight. Which is why we've implemented Protocol Delta 7. No one enters secure areas without secondary authentication and visual confirmation. As the briefing continued, outlining containment strategies and response scenarios, Parker observed the interaction between Catherine, Harrison, and Admiral Blackwood. There was a shorthand communication between them, a professional intimacy born of shared experience and mutual respect. They operated like a precision instrument, each contributing their specialized expertise to form a cohesive whole. It was Harrison who first noticed the pattern emerging on the security feed. His eyes narrowed, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly on his cane. Kate, he said quietly, interrupting the discussion. Look at grid section Echo 4. Catherine turned to the display, her gaze instantly finding the anomaly that Harrison had identified. 3 separate security alerts, each minor enough to warrant only a standard response, but positioned in a triangular pattern around a seemingly random section of the base. Not random, she murmured, her mind mapping the pattern. That's the underground access point to the auxiliary power systems for the command bunker. Blackwood moved closer to the display. Why would he draw attention to it with security alerts? He wouldn't, Catherine replied, her posture shifting subtly into operational readiness. Unless it's already been compromised, Harrison finished grimly, and the alerts are meant to direct our security resources away from it, not toward it. Catherine turned to Blackwood. Admiral, we need to inspect that access point immediately. Minimal personnel, absolute discretion. Blackwood nodded sharply. Take Parker. His security clearance will get you through any checkpoints without raising questions. As they prepared to move, Harrison caught Catherine's arm, his weathered face solemn. Kate, if Baranov is already inside the auxiliary systems... I know, she replied quietly. We're running out of time. Parker gathered his equipment with efficient movements, checking his sidearm and radio. As he and Catherine moved toward the door, Harrison called out once more. Lieutenant, the old warrior said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of hard-won wisdom. Watch the shadows. Baranov doesn't move in straight lines. Outside, the night air carried the salt tang of the Atlantic, a familiar comfort rendered strange by the circumstances. They moved through the base with purposeful strides, their route indirect, using service corridors and maintenance passages to avoid main thoroughfares where their presence might be noted and reported. If Salamander is watching the security feeds, Catherine explained as they navigated a utility tunnel, we need to minimize our digital footprint. Parker nodded, impressed by her thoroughness. You've done this before. Hunting ghosts? A flicker of something, perhaps dark humor, crossed her face. More times than I care to remember. They emerged near the administrative complex, the buildings dark except for security lighting. Catherine led them toward a nondescript maintenance shed positioned between larger structures, its ordinary appearance belying its significance. Auxiliary power access point, she explained in a low voice. One of 4 hardened channels that provide backup systems to the command bunker. Parker studied the small structure with new understanding. Perfect infiltration point, minimal security presence, low traffic area, direct access to critical systems. Exactly why it would appeal to Baranov, Catherine confirmed. His operational signature always favored the path of least expectation rather than least resistance. They approached cautiously, Catherine's movements fluid and silent despite the tactical gear she now wore. Parker followed her lead, maintaining distance and sight lines as they had established during their brief operational planning. The shed appeared undisturbed, its security seal intact, the keypad lock showing no signs of tampering. Catherine examined it with critical eyes, then stepped back. Too clean, she murmured. Parker understood immediately. No dust disturbance, no scuff marks, no indication of recent access. Yet the area had been targeted by the triangulated security alerts. The absence of evidence was itself evidence. Catherine gestured for Parker to provide authentication, and he entered his security code into the keypad. The door unlocked with a soft click, and they entered the small space, weapons ready. Inside, the shed contained standard maintenance equipment, shelving units with technical manuals, and a floor hatch secured with another electronic lock. Nothing appeared disturbed or out of place. Catherine knelt by the hatch, examining the locking mechanism with a small tactical light. Her expression remained neutral, but Parker detected the slight tightening around her eyes that he was learning to recognize as concern. The lock has been reset, she said quietly. Recently. How can you tell? The display shows it was last accessed at 14:27 today, but the duty log shows the scheduled maintenance was completed at 13:52. She rose smoothly. Someone accessed this hatch after the maintenance crew left, then reset the electronic record, but they couldn't alter the internal timestamp in the system itself. Parker felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Salamander. Or Baranov himself, Catherine confirmed. Either way, they've already penetrated the auxiliary systems. She activated her secure radio. Artemis to base. Access point Echo 4 has been compromised. Timestamp indicates penetration at 14:27 hours. Requesting full diagnostic of auxiliary power systems and security sweep of all connected access points. Harrison's voice responded immediately. Copy, Artemis. Initiating diagnostics. Be advised, we're seeing unusual access patterns in the main security database. Multiple high-level credentials being used simultaneously across different terminals. Catherine's expression hardened. They're making their move. Distraction protocols at the perimeter, simultaneous database access to modify security parameters. Classic Soviet maskirovka, Parker observed, recalling his counterintelligence training. Multiple layers of deception to mask the real objective. Exactly, Catherine confirmed, a flicker of approval crossing her face at his assessment. And it means we need to move now. The command bunker is the target, and they're already inside the support systems. As they secured the access point and began moving toward the central command complex, alarms suddenly blared across the base. Not the controlled security alerts of earlier, but the full emergency protocol indicating imminent threat. Harrison's voice came through their comms, tense but controlled. Kate, we've identified a breach in the environmental control systems for the command bunker. Someone's introduced a foreign agent into the air filtration. Evacuation status? Catherine demanded, their pace increasing to a controlled run. In progress, but it's chaos. Multiple conflicting orders, authentication challenges, communications disruptions. Deliberate confusion, Catherine assessed immediately, creating disorder within the command structure, forcing personnel to bypass security protocols in the interest of speed. The perfect condition for Salamander to operate without scrutiny, Parker added. They reached the main administration building, the epicenter of Norfolk's command structure and the access point to the hardened bunkers below. Security personnel moved with controlled urgency, shepherding officers and essential staff toward designated evacuation points. Catherine scanned the crowd with the practiced eye of a hunter, looking not at faces but at movement patterns, at the subtle tells that distinguish genuine urgency from manufactured panic. There, she said suddenly, nodding toward a senior officer moving against the flow of evacuation, heading deeper into the complex rather than toward the exits. Captain Lewis Jensen, Deputy Director of Atlantic Fleet Operations. Parker recognized the name from their suspect list. He has alpha-level access to the command bunker. And he's moving with purpose, not confusion, Catherine observed. Follow my lead, but maintain distance. If he is Salamander, he's been trained to detect surveillance. They tracked Jensen through the building, maintaining visual contact while navigating the controlled chaos of the evacuation. The captain moved with confident purpose, using his authority to pass checkpoints, his credentials unquestioned in the emergency. He's heading for the secure elevator to the command level, Parker noted as Jensen approached a restricted access point. Catherine's expression hardened. That elevator should be locked down during an evacuation. The only override comes from the Admiral himself. Or someone who's hacked the security protocols, Parker suggested. Exactly. They watched as Jensen entered his code, the elevator doors opening smoothly despite the emergency lockdown that should have prevented access. As he entered, Catherine made her decision. We take him now, she stated, moving forward with the fluid grace that Parker now recognized as her transition to combat readiness. Before he reaches the command level. They approached the elevator, Catherine entering an override code that Admiral Blackwood had provided. The doors opened at the sub-level, revealing Jensen standing calmly inside, a knowing expression settling over his features as he saw Catherine. Commander Reynolds, he acknowledged with a slight nod, as if their confrontation was expected. Or should I say, Artemis Operative Alpha 6. Catherine's weapon remained trained on him, her stance balanced and ready. Captain Jensen? Or is it Salamander? A thin smile crossed Jensen's face, not the expression of a man caught, but of one whose plans were proceeding as anticipated. Salamander, he confirmed, his American accent giving way to the faintest trace of a Russian cadence, though I haven't heard that name spoken aloud in many years. Parker maintained his position, covering the elevator's only exit, his mind processing the implication. Captain Jensen, a senior officer with over 20 years of service, a man with access to America's most sensitive naval operations, was a Russian deep cover agent. It's over, Jensen, Catherine stated, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had confronted similar threats countless times. The environmental system has been secured. Your compound has been neutralized. Baranov's operation has failed. Jensen's smile didn't waver. Has it? You're here confronting me, which means you're not where you should be. His eyes, cold and calculating, shifted to Parker. And neither is the lieutenant, whose security credentials would be most useful right now in the command center. Understanding dawned on Parker with cold clarity. We've been diverted. You're not Salamander. A necessary sacrifice, Jensen replied with a slight shrug. Baranov said you would be formidable, Commander. He remembered you from Berlin. Catherine's expression remained professionally neutral, but Parker detected the momentary tightening of her grip on her weapon, the only indication that Jensen's words had struck a nerve. Where is Salamander? She demanded. Jensen glanced at his watch with casual indifference. By now, implementing the final phase of White Birch. You understand, of course, that I can't allow you to interfere. His hand moved with practiced speed, producing a small device from his pocket. Catherine reacted instantly, her weapon discharging with precise accuracy, striking Jensen's shoulder before he could activate whatever he held. He staggered but remained standing, his expression shifting from confidence to grim determination. Too late, he said, his thumb pressing the device's activation switch as he fell. Nothing happened. Jensen's eyes widened in genuine surprise, looking from the device to Catherine with confusion. Frequency jammer, she explained calmly. Standard protocol when approaching a suspected hostile operative. Your transmitter can't communicate with whatever it's meant to trigger. For the first time, uncertainty crossed Jensen's face. Impossible. The protocols were designed 30 years ago, Catherine finished for him. Technology evolves. Tactics adapt. You've been playing a game with outdated rules, Captain. As security personnel secured Jensen, Harrison's voice came through their comms. Kate, we've identified unusual activity in the communications center. Admiral Blackwood's credentials are being used to access the nuclear command protocols, but he's currently in the evacuation control point with me. Catherine's eyes met Parker's, understanding flowing between them without words. Who's at the communications center? She demanded. Commander Matthews, Harrison replied grimly. Naval Special Warfare Liaison. Matthews, Catherine repeated, the name carrying new weight. The one person who would know every detail of our operation, who would have access to all our security countermeasures. Salamander, Parker confirmed, the pieces falling into place. Jensen was the diversion. They moved with urgent purpose through the complex, navigating the controlled chaos of the evacuation. The communications center was 6 levels below ground, a hardened facility designed to maintain command continuity during a nuclear event. Under normal circumstances, it would be staffed by multiple officers and technicians. During an evacuation, it operated with minimal personnel, making it the perfect target for someone who didn't want witnesses. Matthews has been the Naval Special Warfare Liaison for 15 years, Parker said as they descended the secure stairwell, the elevators disabled during the emergency. He has access to every classified operation, every security protocol. The perfect position for a deep cover agent, Catherine agreed. Hiding in plain sight within the special operations community, the last place counterintelligence would look for a Russian asset. They reached the communications level, the security checkpoint unmanned, another anomaly that confirmed their suspicions. The heavy blast doors that should have been secured during an evacuation stood partially open, emergency lighting casting long shadows through the gap. Catherine approached cautiously, her movements silent and precise. Parker followed her lead, maintaining his position as they entered the darkened facility. The communications center was eerily quiet, the normal hum of electronics and conversation replaced by the soft, methodical clicking of a single keyboard. In the dim blue glow of emergency lighting, a solitary figure worked at the main console. Commander John Matthews, Naval Special Warfare Liaison, and, they now knew, the Soviet deep cover agent codenamed Salamander. Catherine moved like a shadow, covering the distance to Matthews with fluid, silent steps. Parker circled to the opposite flank, establishing crossfire positioning without a word exchanged between them. Step away from the console, Commander, Catherine ordered, her weapon trained with unwavering precision. Matthews turned slowly, his expression composed despite being caught in the act. There was something different in his demeanor now, a coldness that had always been concealed beneath a facade of professional camaraderie. "Catherine," he acknowledged with a slight nod, "I wondered if you'd figure it out in time." Jensen played his part well, but he was always too eager, too obvious in his ambition, a necessary sacrifice to occupy your attention. "White birch ends now," Catherine stated firmly. "Step away from the console." Matthews smiled thinly. "White birch ended decades ago with the Soviet Union. This is something else entirely, something personal." "Baranov," Catherine surmised, "this isn't about state actors anymore. It's about finishing what he started in Berlin." "Perceptive as always," Matthews confirmed. "Oleg never forgave the humiliation of the Soviet collapse. The abandonment of operatives like me, embedded for decades. Our sacrifices forgotten by a government that no longer existed." His fingers continued to move across the keyboard, even as he spoke. "This operation isn't about restoring Russian glory. It's about proving that the old ways still have power." Parker maintained his position, weapon trained on Matthews, but his eyes caught the code appearing on the screen, a sequence he recognized from his security training. "Commander," he called to Catherine, "he's activating the emergency broadcast system. Fleet-wide communications override." Catherine's expression hardened. "The nuclear command and control channels. He's creating a false authorization for strategic launch." Matthew's smile widened slightly. "Not a launch. Even I couldn't fabricate those protocols convincingly. Just a message transmitted on the emergency channel to every vessel in the Atlantic Fleet, appearing to come directly from Norfolk Command." "What message?" Catherine demanded. "Confirmation of what many have suspected for years," Matthews replied calmly, "that American Naval Command has been compromised at the highest levels, that communications can't be trusted, that the chain of command is broken." His eyes, cold and calculating, met Catherine's. Imagine the chaos when every captain must decide for himself whether orders are legitimate or compromised. The paralysis of the entire Atlantic Fleet, achieved not through weapons, but through doubt. Parker understood the strategy with chilling clarity. Not a direct attack, but something more insidious. The destruction of trust in the command structure itself. A psychological weapon more devastating than any bomb. "It won't work," Catherine stated with quiet certainty. "Step away from the console, John, now." Matthew's hand moved suddenly, reaching beneath the console. Catherine reacted with inhuman speed, her weapon discharging with precise accuracy. The bullet struck Matthew's shoulder, spinning him away from whatever he had been reaching for. But the commander's other hand had already pressed a final command sequence, activating the transmission protocol. Red warning lights flashed across the console as the emergency broadcast system engaged. "Too late," Matthews gasped, clutching his wounded shoulder. "The message is sending. Authentication protocols overridden. 30 years of patience finally rewarded." Catherine moved to the console, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Lieutenant, secure him," she ordered without looking back. Parker approached Matthews cautiously, maintaining weapon discipline as he secured the wounded officer. "The transmission?" he asked Catherine. "Attempting to abort," she replied, her focus absolute as she navigated the complex system. "But he's locked out the cancellation protocols. We need Admiral Blackwood's biometric authentication to stop it." "There's no time," Matthews said with grim satisfaction. "The message will reach every vessel in the fleet within 90 seconds. Baranov wins, even from the grave." Catherine's head snapped up. "From the grave?" A cold smile crossed Matthew's face. "You didn't think he'd risk capture, did you? Oleg completed his mission when he activated me. His role was finished." Parker processed this information with growing concern. "Commander, if Baranov is no longer a factor, then there's something else at play," Catherine finished, her mind working through scenarios with tactical precision. Her gaze fell on Matthew's wounded shoulder, then to the console where he had been working. Understanding dawned in her eyes. "It's not just a message," she stated, sudden certainty in her voice. "The broadcast system is carrying more than text. You've embedded a virus in the transmission packet." Matthew's expression confirmed her assessment. 30 years of technological advancement, Commander. The modern Navy depends on network systems, shared databases, integrated communications. One properly crafted piece of code, delivered through a trusted channel, could disable the entire fleet's operational capabilities, Catherine concluded grimly. Not paralysis through doubt, but through system failure. She turned back to the console, her approach changing as she assessed this new threat. Parker, contact Harrison. We need a complete communications shutdown, base-wide, then fleet-wide. Priority Alpha. As Parker relayed the order through his secure radio, Catherine worked with focused intensity, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. This wasn't just combat skill, Parker realized. It was technical expertise that hadn't been included in her official file. The virus is designed to piggyback on the authentication protocols, she explained as she worked. It uses Admiral Blackwood's security credentials to bypass firewalls and penetrate command and control systems. Can you stop it? Parker asked, maintaining his guard on Matthews. Not conventionally, she replied, but every system has a weakness, even ones designed by Russian intelligence. Catherine's approach shifted, her commands becoming more complex, more unorthodox. She wasn't attempting to stop the transmission directly, but creating something new, a counter protocol that would ride the same authentication wave. What are you doing? Matthews demanded, his professional composure cracking as he recognized that something had changed in the equation. Fighting fire with fire, Catherine replied without looking up. You embedded a virus in the transmission. I'm embedding a vaccine. Parker watched as she completed the sequence, her final keystroke coinciding with the system's confirmation that the transmission had been sent. For a moment, silence filled the communications center, broken only by the soft hum of electronics and Matthew's labored breathing. It's done, Catherine said finally, stepping back from the console. Your virus will reach the fleet, but so will my countermeasure. They'll cancel each other out, leaving only the text of your message, which will be immediately recognized as unauthorized once Admiral Blackwood confirms he didn't send it. Matthews stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. How did you know? The virus was designed by the best cyber specialists in Russian intelligence. Because I've spent the last 30 years studying how Baranov thinks, Catherine replied simply, and because you made a fundamental error in your planning. What error? Matthews asked despite himself. Catherine's eyes, cool and assessing, met his directly. You assumed you were the only deep cover operative in this room. The understanding dawned on Matthew's face. The realization that Catherine Reynolds, the Artemis operative, had spent her career operating in the same shadow world he had, but from the opposite side. Two ghosts from the Cold War, their paths finally converging in this underground facility decades after their respective missions began. Berlin, he said quietly. You were there. I was, Catherine confirmed, and unlike you, I never forgot what I was fighting for. The aftermath of crisis carried its own particular rhythm at Naval Station Norfolk. As security teams secured the communications center and medical personnel attended to Matthew's wound, the base gradually shifted from emergency response to recovery operations. The evacuation order was rescinded, personnel returned to their stations, and the machinery of Naval Command resumed its normal functions, forever changed by the knowledge that, for decades, a foreign agent had moved freely through its most secure spaces. In Admiral Blackwood's office, the debriefing carried the solemn weight of both victory and revelation. Catherine Reynolds stood at parade rest before the Admiral's desk, her posture military precise despite the exhaustion evident in the fine lines around her eyes. Lieutenant Parker and Bill Harrison completed the small circle, the four of them isolated in a bubble of classified knowledge that would never appear in official reports. Matthews has been a naval officer for 27 years, Blackwood stated, the disbelief still evident in his voice. He's attended my children's weddings. He was with me in Desert Storm. The best deep cover agents become the person they're pretending to be, Harrison observed quietly. They build real relationships, form genuine connections. The deception is in their core loyalty, not in their daily interactions. Catherine nodded in agreement. Matthews, or whatever his real name is, was likely recruited and trained by the KGB in the late 1980s, provided with a carefully crafted identity, and inserted into the naval officer pipeline. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed, he was already established, his cover unquestioned. And Baranov maintained contact all these years, Parker added, the pieces still fitting together in his mind. waiting for the right moment to activate him. Baranov represented the old guard of Soviet intelligence, Harrison explained. True believers who never accepted the collapse of the system they served. To them, the Cold War never ended. It just went quiet for a time. Admiral Blackwood leaned back in his chair, the weight of command evident in his bearing. And Jensen, how does he fit into this? A secondary asset, Catherine replied. Recruited later, possibly after the Soviet collapse, by elements of Russian intelligence who maintained the old networks. His role was to divert our attention, to make us believe we had identified Salamander while Matthews implemented the actual operation. Two moles, Blackwood said grimly, both in positions of significant authority and access. It raises questions about how many others might still be in place, Harrison noted, his weathered face solemn. Sleeper agents embedded decades ago, waiting for activation. The implications settled heavily over the room. The possibility that other salamanders existed throughout the military and intelligence communities, their loyalties hidden beneath years of seemingly dedicated service. What about Baranov himself, Parker asked. Matthews implied he was dead. Catherine's expression remained neutral, but Parker detected a subtle shift in her posture, a tightening that suggested personal investment beyond professional duty. Initial reports confirm a body found near the base perimeter, she replied. Identification is preliminary, but physical characteristics match Baranov. Cause of death appears to be self-administered poison, the same Soviet-era compound found in the capsules used by his team. He completed his mission by activating Matthews, then eliminated himself to avoid capture, Harrison surmised, consistent with old KGB protocols for deep cover operations. So it's over, Parker concluded, though the question lingered in his tone. Catherine turned to him, her eyes carrying the weight of experience that transcended her years. This operation is contained, Lieutenant, but the echoes of the Cold War continue to reverberate. There will be others like Matthews, like Baranov, true believers fighting conflicts that officially ended decades ago. Admiral Blackwood rose from his desk, his decision formed. We need to implement a comprehensive counterintelligence review. Every senior officer with access to critical systems, every communications specialist, every intelligence liaison. We can't afford another salamander. With respect, Admiral, Harrison interjected, traditional counterintelligence methods won't identify these assets. They're too deeply embedded, their covers too carefully crafted. We need a different approach. Blackwood turned to Catherine. Commander Reynolds, I'm establishing a specialized task force under your command, full operational authority, classification level Theta 9. Your mission is to identify and neutralize any remaining deep cover assets within naval command structures. Catherine nodded once, acceptance conveyed in the simplest of gestures. Yes, sir. Lieutenant Parker, Blackwood continued, your performance during this crisis has demonstrated the kind of thinking we need. I'm reassigning you to Commander Reynolds' team as operations coordinator. Parker straightened, surprised but resolute. Thank you, sir. I'm honored. Don't thank me yet, Lieutenant, Blackwood replied with grim humor. You're about to enter a shadow war that doesn't officially exist, hunting ghosts who look exactly like loyal American officers. As the meeting concluded, Parker found himself walking alongside Catherine down the corridor, both of them processing the implications of their new assignment. Commander, he began, still reconciling the woman beside him with the operative he had witnessed in action. How do you do it? Live in both worlds, the official military structure and whatever Artemis really is? Catherine considered the question with the careful assessment he had come to recognize as her standard approach to communication. You compartmentalize, she replied finally. The mission becomes your anchor point. Everything else, regulations, protocols, conventional thinking, those are tools to be used or set aside as the situation requires. That sounds challenging, Parker admitted. A ghost of a smile crossed Catherine's face, the closest thing to humor he had seen from her. Hence the rigorous psychological screening for Artemis candidates, Lieutenant. Not everyone can maintain the necessary cognitive dissonance without fracturing. They reach the security checkpoint, beyond which lay the normal operations of the base, personnel going about their duties, ships preparing for deployment, the visible machinery of American naval power functioning as it had for decades, oblivious to the shadow conflict that had just been waged in its midst. We begin tomorrow, Catherine stated, her tone shifting back to professional command. 0700, Secure Briefing Room Alpha, will start by establishing operational parameters and reviewing potential targets. Parker nodded, but a question still lingered. Commander, there's something I don't understand. When you confronted Matthews in the communications center, you said he made a fundamental error in assuming he was the only deep cover operative in the room. What did you mean? Catherine's eyes met his directly, carrying a weight of history and purpose that transcended rank and protocol. Artemis operatives live in the shadows, Lieutenant. We operate without acknowledgement, without recognition, our achievements classified beyond the reach of history. In many ways, our existence is as carefully concealed as any deep cover foreign agent. She paused, ensuring her meaning was clear. The difference is in what we're fighting for. With that, she turned and walked away, her movements carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime balancing on the knife edge between worlds. A shadow warrior whose greatest victories would never be recorded in any official history. 1 year later, Naval Station Norfolk operated under a new security paradigm. What had once been considered paranoid vigilance was now standard protocol. What had been dismissed as Cold War thinking was now recognized as necessary caution. The revelation that deep cover agents had penetrated the highest levels of command had fundamentally altered the institution's understanding of trust. Lieutenant Commander James Parker, recently promoted and reassigned to the newly established Counterintelligence Special Activities Division, stood at the window of his office overlooking the harbor. The morning sun transformed the gray warships into gleaming sentinels of American naval power, the visible counterpoint to the invisible war he now waged alongside Catherine Reynolds. The past year had transformed Parker's understanding of military service. The rigid hierarchies and by-the-book procedures that had defined his early career now seemed like the visible surface of a much deeper, more complex reality. He had learned to see patterns where others saw coincidence, to question what others accepted without thought. A knock at his door interrupted his reflection. Turning, he found Bill Harrison standing in the doorway, leaning on his cane but carrying himself with the same quiet dignity that had impressed Parker from their first meeting. "Colonel," Parker greeted him with genuine respect, "I didn't know you were on base today." Harrison entered, closing the door behind him. Age and old injuries might have slowed his movements, but his eyes remained sharp, assessing the office with the habitual vigilance of a career intelligence officer. "Just passing through," Harrison replied, settling into a chair with the careful movements of a man managing chronic pain. "Thought I'd check on how my protégé's protégé is adapting to his new role." Parker smiled slightly at the description. Over the past year, he had indeed become something of a student to Catherine Reynolds, learning the unwritten rules and unseen patterns of the shadow conflict they waged. "It's been enlightening," Parker admitted, taking a seat across from Harrison. "We've identified 3 more potential deep cover assets within Atlantic Fleet operations. Commander Reynolds is coordinating with naval intelligence to establish surveillance protocols." Harrison nodded, unsurprised. The Matthews revelation was just the beginning. For every salamander we find, there are likely others still hidden. "That's what keeps me awake at night," Parker confessed. "The idea that we're surrounded by people who appear to be loyal colleagues but serve another master entirely." "Welcome to the world Catherine has lived in for her entire career," Harrison said with grim understanding. "It changes you, doesn't it, once you've seen behind the curtain?" Their conversation was interrupted by a secure message notification on Parker's terminal. "Operation Evergreen approved. Briefing 1400 hours." Harrison caught the shift in Parker's expression. "New hunting ground?" "Potentially," Parker replied carefully. "Commander Reynolds has identified a pattern within the Pacific Fleet command structure that mirrors what we found with Matthews." As Harrison prepared to leave, Parker found himself asking the question that had lingered in his mind since the events of the previous year. "Colonel, do you think we'll ever find all of them? The sleeper agents? The ghosts from the Cold War?" Harrison paused at the door, his weathered face reflecting decades of experience. "No, Lieutenant Commander, we won't," he replied with simple honesty. "But that doesn't mean we stop hunting. The ones we do find represent real threats to everything we're sworn to protect." With that, Harrison departed, leaving Parker with the sobering reality of the mission he had inherited, a mission without end, without clear victories, defined more by vigilance than achievement. Shaw. Later that afternoon, as the briefing on Operation Evergreen concluded, Catherine motioned for Parker to remain behind. When they were alone, she activated additional privacy protocols, a level of caution that suggested the conversation would venture beyond even their normal classified discussions. Bill told me he's given you the first chapter, she said, her tone neutral but carrying an undercurrent Parker had learned to recognize as significant. Parker nodded, placing a thumb drive on the table between them. He said you should review it before he continues. Catherine studied the small device, her expression unreadable. He's documenting what no one else can or will, the women who fought in shadows while others stood in the light. She pocketed the drive, her gaze distant. History remembers what is recorded, not what remains classified. If no one documents what Artemis accomplished, what we sacrificed, it will be as if we never existed at all. Parker understood the weight of this truth. The achievements that defined Catherine Reynolds would never appear in official histories, her valor never acknowledged publicly. Is that why you do it? He asked quietly. Not for recognition, but for the mission itself. She considered his question with the careful assessment he had come to expect from her. I do it because someone has to, she replied finally. Because the threats we face don't always announce themselves with declarations of war or military formations. Her eyes held his with unwavering focus. The world is full of Matthews, Parker, people who appear to be one thing while serving another purpose entirely. Some of them target what we're sworn to protect. And those are the ones we hunt. In that moment, Parker understood something fundamental about Catherine Reynolds that had eluded him despite a year of working closely with her. She wasn't simply a professional executing missions with exceptional skill. She was a guardian standing watch in darkness. Purpose endures when recognition fades, Lieutenant Commander, she said. Remember that as you continue down this path. 3 days later, a crisp autumn morning found Catherine Reynolds standing alone before a simple granite marker in Arlington National Cemetery. The headstone bore no special designation, nothing to indicate the extraordinary service of the woman buried beneath it. Sarah Mitchell, Artemis Team Alpha, killed in Berlin in '91. Catherine placed a small trident pin against the stone, the gold catching the morning light. It matched the one on her own worn jacket, symbols of a brotherhood that had reluctantly accepted sisters in the shadows. We found him, Sarah, she said quietly. Matthews, Salamander, the one who compromised the operation. The wind rustled through nearby trees, nature's only response to her words. Boronov's gone too, took the coward's way out rather than face capture. Her voice carried no bitterness, only the flat certainty of a mission completed. It took 30 years, but we finished what we started in Berlin. She touched the cold stone briefly. Your sacrifice wasn't forgotten, not by those who matter. As Catherine turned to leave, she noticed a familiar figure waiting at a respectful distance. Bill Harrison, leaning on his cane, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. I thought I might find you here, he said as she approached. Today's the anniversary. Catherine nodded once, no explanation needed between them. Harrison had been her handler for Berlin, had lived with the weight of that failed operation as she had. I brought something, Harrison said, offering the portfolio. The complete first section, your story from Annapolis through Berlin. Catherine accepted it with careful hands. You're really doing this. Someone has to record the truth, Harrison replied, even if it stays locked away for decades. They walked slowly through the cemetery, two warriors from different generations united by shared purpose and the burden of unacknowledged service. Parker's showing promise, Catherine said after a time. Harrison smiled slightly. He reminds me of you when you were younger, before Berlin hardened the edges. We all lose something in this work, she acknowledged. The question is whether what we preserve is worth the cost. They paused at the cemetery gates, Harrison studying her face with the careful assessment of someone who had known her longer than perhaps anyone else in her professional life. Will you continue, Kate, now that Baranov and Matthews are gone? Catherine gazed back across the sea of white markers stretching into the distance, each representing service, sacrifice, a story both known and unknown. The war never truly ended, Bill. It just changed forms. Her eyes, cool and determined, met his. And someone needs to stand watch. Harrison nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. They parted ways at the cemetery entrance, the old warrior and his protege, each carrying a piece of a shadow history that might never be fully told. 2 days later, Lieutenant Commander Parker received a message on his secure terminal. Operation Evergreen commences 0600 tomorrow. Briefing Room Alpha. Below it, an addendum from Catherine. The greatest victories are the ones no one knows you won. Remember that, Parker? As he prepared for the next hunt, Parker understood the truth of her words. The battle continued, as it always had, not with missiles and aircraft carriers, but with whispers and secrets, with loyalty and betrayal, with ghosts from a conflict most believed had ended decades ago. And standing guard against these invisible threats were warriors whose very existence was classified, silent sentinels whose true valor could never be publicly acknowledged. Their legacy lived not in medals displayed or monuments erected, but in threats neutralized, in attacks prevented, in institutions preserved. It was a legacy written in shadows, protected by silence, measured not in recognition, but in purpose fulfilled. For Catherine Reynolds, for Bill Harrison, for James Parker, and for all those who had chosen to fight in darkness so others could live in light, that purpose was and would always be enough.